These are the 10 most beautiful military jets ever. This list is compiled using the Mooch Tally, which, as regular viewers of the channel know, is a proprietary algorithm using data to determine the rank of each airplane. In the case of this list, there are 3 variables, each with a value between 1 and 10. The first is beauty or curb appeal. If you were in an air show and saw the jet for the first time, what would your reaction be? The second is operational performance. What impact did the jet have during its service life? Was it used as intended, or did it morph into another role, or was it simply a beauty queen who made no contribution to society once the pageant was over? The third is subscriber input. How many mentions did the jet get in the channel community tab comments section? In the case of this list, the overall Mooch Tally is the sum of the 3 variables. And remember, as with previous lists in the history of this channel, the Mooch Tally isn't opinion, it's science. Now, because we had thousands of subscriber inputs for this list, we're also including 8 honorable mentions without a Mooch Tally number and in no specific order. And they are the RA-5 Vigilante, a carrier-based reconnaissance jet with gorgeous lines that screamed speed. The XB-70 Valkyrie, the ill-fated Air Force bomber that was perhaps too beautiful for its time. The F-5 Tiger II, sleek and versatile as both a fighter for nations across the globe and an aggressor aircraft for the U.S. Air Force and Navy. The Mirage III, the French Delta Wing beauty. The Eurofighter Typhoon, the multinational fighter attack jet with sex appeal courtesy of its canards as well as its Delta Wing. The Avro Vulcan, the British bomber that also made the ugliest jets ever list, so getting honorable mention here is vindication of sorts. And the A-4 Skyhawk, the Cold War era workhorse with simple good looks that served in the attack role both from land and sea and also as a bandit at Top Gun and other aggressor squadrons. Now here's the top 10 most beautiful military jets ever. Number 10 is the Su27 NATO codename Flanker. Originally designed by the Soviet Union for the long-range bomber escort mission, the Flanker gets a 7 for Mooch Tally operational performance for how it evolved into an attack platform in addition to being a capable fighter. It also gets points for how the design informed follow-on models, including a carrier-based one, and for how many other countries added it to their air orders of battle. The Flanker gets a 7 for beauty for its elegant lines that one subscriber likened to those of a swan. And it gets a 3 for the number of subscriber mentions in the channel community tab comments. All of that adds up to a Mooch Tally of 17. Number 9 is the F14 Starfighter. One of the Century series designed by Lockheed's Kelly Johnson, who was the man behind a number of iconic airplanes of that era, the F-104 was the product of a time when the threat of the Soviet Union loomed large, and the relatively new U.S. Air Force had the luxury of rapid innovation and specialized designs. The Starfighter was an interceptor with a thin fuselage and short, ultra-thin wings designed to go fast in a straight line. It was the first production airplane to reach Mach 2 at an altitude of 100,000 feet, and in 1958 held the record for speed, altitude, and time to climb. The same design characteristics that made the F-104 a terrible dogfighter in terms of turning earned it a 7 for beauty. It's sleek and the shape makes it look fast even sitting in the chalks. It gets a 7 for operational performance because it was used by the U.S. Air Force for 11 years and the Air National Guard for another 6 years beyond that. A number of NATO countries manufactured the Starfighter under license from Lockheed, and the Italians used it until 2004. And the F-104 gets a 4 for the number of subscriber mentions in the channel community tab comments. All of that adds up to a Mooch Tally of 18. Number 8 is the B58 Hustler. The Convair B58 Hustler was designed for one thing: to deliver a single nuclear weapon deep into the Soviet Union while outrunning Russian interceptors. However, the introduction of high-altitude surface-to-air missiles forced the Hustler into a low-level attack role, which it could do well thanks to its 4 GE J79 engines, but not for very long due to fuel consumption at low altitude. The original mission design and silver shine of its aluminum fuselage gives the Hustler the good looks of a classic muscle car, which gets a Mooch Tally beauty value of 8. Its operational performance number is 5, limited by how the threat reduced its effectiveness and the fact it was hard to fly and had a high accident rate as a result. And the B58 gets a 6 for the number of subscriber mentions. All of that adds up to a Mooch Tally of 19. Number 7 is the F22 Raptor. The Raptor was introduced in the mid-2000s to replace the aging F15 Eagle in the Air Force air superiority role and came with 5th-generation technology, including stealth low observables and vector thrust nozzles, which gave it unprecedented dogfighting moves, especially in a slow-speed fight. The Raptor gets an 8 for beauty. a score that's slightly lowered by the otherwise gorgeous fighter's squatty appearance on deck due to short landing gear. And you could say the F-22 was ahead of its time or behind its time. In either case, it had the misfortune of being in the inventory during the 20 years of asymmetric wars post 9/11. So therefore, it never saw any real-world action of any major consequence until it made headlines by shooting down several Chinese spy balloons that flew over the continental United States in 2023. And although the original plan was to replace all F-15s with F-22s, fewer than 200 were ultimately built, which is less than 17% of the Eagle inventory. As a result, it only gets a 5 for operational performance. And the Raptor gets a 7 for the number of subscribers who made it their choice in the channel community tab comments. All of that adds up to a Mooch Tally for the F-22 of 20. Number 6 is the B-1 Lancer. The B-1 was developed to take up the slack in the Air Force's penetrator mission, where the XB-70 program had failed and the B-52 lacked the speed required. The B-1A program was started during the Nixon administration, but subsequently canceled when Jimmy Carter took office in lieu of improved ICBMs and what eventually became the B-2 Spirit. But the B-1 was given another life in the early 80s when Ronald Reagan became president with a defense strategy to win the Cold War by outspending the Soviet Union. The B-1B's main mission was high-speed, low-altitude ingress, flying below the enemy's radar coverage. However, surface-to-air missile development throughout the 80s invalidated that tactic, proved by the fact that most of the coalition airplanes shot down during Desert Storm were flying low when they got hit. The B-1B gets 9 for beauty, its low observable design giving it graceful curves along the leading edges, and its requirement for speed creating sleek lines across the length of the fuselage. And it's at its most beautiful airborne, with the swing wing swept fully aft. It gets a 6 for operational performance for how the Air Force stuck with the bone, which is the bomber's nickname derived from combining B and 1, for decades even though the air war had passed the airplane's original mission by. At the turn of the century, the B-1 was morphed into a long-range, high-altitude precision strike platform used in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan for close air support, and most recently conducting retaliatory strikes out of Dyess Air Force Base in Texas against IRGC targets in Syria and Iraq using JDAM. And the bone gets a 7 for the number of subscribers who mentioned it in the channel community tab comments. Those numbers give the B-1 a Mooch Tally of 22. Number 5 is the F-4 Phantom. The legendary F-4 Phantom first entered service with the U.S. Navy as the frontline tandem-seat carrier-based fighter attack aircraft, followed by the Marine Corps and Air Force, and over 23 years, 1958 to 1981, McDonnell and then McDonnell Douglas manufactured 5,195 Phantoms, making it the most produced American supersonic military aircraft in history. The F-4 was a workhorse for the U.S. military in both the fighter and attack roles during the Vietnam War. In fact, the 5 American airmen who became aces during that war, 1 Air Force pilot, 2 Air Force weapons systems officers, 1 Navy pilot, and 1 radar intercept officer, all did so in the Phantom. The F-4 gets a 7 for beauty with its sharp lines across the long nose and spine of the fuselage and signature upward cant of the wingtips and downward slant of the horizontal stabilizers. It exudes power and is another one of those that looks fast while sitting in the chocks. The Phantom gets a perfect 10 for operational performance, not only for making aces during the Vietnam War, but for doing the same for Israeli pilots during the wars in the Middle East and Iranian pilots during the Iran-Iraq War. Both the Blue Angels and the Thunderbirds used the F-4 at the same time for a few years. The F-4 gets a lot of points for endurance as well. It was used by the U.S. for 36 years and remains in service with the Air Forces of Iran, South Korea, Greece, and Turkey. The Phantom gets a 7 for the number of subscriber mentions. All of that results in a Mooch Tally of 24 for the F-4. Number 4 is the F-15 Eagle. Following the Vietnam War, the U.S. Air Force was looking to field a dedicated air superiority fighter without the compromises inherent to multi-role airplanes like the F-4. With the forceful input of John Boyd's fighter mafia, ultimately they decided on the F-15 Eagle built by McDonnell Douglas. While the Eagle was relatively big for a fighter, it was also light and well-powered, which gave it a 1-to-1 thrust-to-weight ratio with combat missile loads, and its wing and fuselage design allowed great maneuverability that made it a tough opponent in the air-to-air arena. During Desert Storm, F-15s racked up 36 of the 39 kills of Iraqi aircraft. The F-15 earns an 8 for beauty. Its lines are well-proportioned but not conservative. It's muscular without sacrificing those lines. The appearance belies a jet that's over 50 years old. old. And it gets a 9 for operational performance, not only for its Desert Storm box score, but for how the design was adapted for a host of other missions, most notably the attack role with the F-15E Strike Eagle. And there's no one in sight, as the Air Force is reacting to airframe shortfalls and budgetary pressure by fielding the F-15EX, a next-generation capability built around a time-tested and combat-proven airframe. The Eagle gets an 8 for the number of subscriber votes in the channel community tab's comments section, all of which gives the F-15 Eagle a Mooch Tally of 25. Number 3 is the F16 Fighting Falcon. While John Boyd's Fighter Mafia was forwarding the concepts for a dedicated air superiority fighter to the Air Force decision makers, they were doing the same thing for a lower cost complement to what became the F-15, except the cheaper airplane also needed to be able to fill the attack role to replace both the F-4 and the A-7. The result was the F-16 Fighting Falcon, also popularly referred to as the Viper. The F-16 incorporated technologies that were bleeding edge at the time. Things like fly-by-wire flight controls and a control stick mounted on the right side of the cockpit instead of between the pilot's legs. The ejection seat is angled 30 degrees aft to give the pilot greater G tolerance, which is a necessary design feature because the Viper is built to sustain more than 9 Gs during a turn. The F-16 gets a 9 for beauty. Its sharp lines give it a look that's as new today as it was 50 years ago. The Viper gets a 9 for operational performance, flying thousands of combat sorties during Desert Storm and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The U.S. Air Force continues to use the F-16 for retaliatory strikes in the Middle East these days. It's also used by nearly a dozen other countries, including Israel. The F-16 is also being provided to the Ukrainian Air Force by several NATO nations, and the Viper continues to serve as an aggressor at Top Gun and the Air Force Weapons School. The Viper gets an 8 for the number of subscriber mentions in the channel community tab. Those numbers add up to a Mooch Tally of 26 for the F-16. Number 2 is the SR71 Blackbird. The SR71 Blackbird was derived from the A-12 Oxcart, the super-secret, supersonic reconnaissance aircraft program developed at Area 51 during the 50s as the Cold War was intensifying. The airplane was given the nickname of Blackbird because of its uniquely avian shape and dark fuselage. And those unique features earned the SR71 a 10 for beauty. There's nothing else like it. I saw one come in for a landing at Norfolk Naval Air Station back in 1990, and it literally stopped traffic in Ocean View as it did. The Blackbird gets an 8 for operational performance, and that's more due to the technological advances the airplane created than the real-world missions it flew. Because of the requirement to fly upwards of Mach 3 at altitudes as high as 80,000 feet, the Blackbird posed design challenges to Kelly Johnson's Skunk Works team they'd never attempted to tackle before, and the choices they made were as cutting-edge as anything done before, or since for that matter. It did fly reconnaissance missions over North Vietnam and Laos starting in 1968. As a secondary mission, SR-71s also used their very loud sonic booms to rattle the windows around Hanoi and raise the spirits of American POWs. Over the course of its reconnaissance missions during the Vietnam War, the North Vietnamese fired approximately 800 SAMs at SR-71s, none of which scored a hit. And several times, Russian MiG-25s tried to run down Blackbirds operating out of Kadena, but they could never catch them. The SR-71 still holds the record for fastest air-breathing manned aircraft, a record it originally set in 1976 after reaching Mach 3.3. And the Blackbird gets a 9 for the large number of subscriber mentions in the channel community tab comments. All of that adds up to the SR-71 getting a Mooch Tally of 27. And number 1 is the F14 Tomcat. The Tomcat began fleet operations in 1973, and by 1983, the U.S. Navy had 22 F-14 squadrons, which gave all but the Japan-based carrier Air Wing 2 Tomcat squadrons each. That meant American aircraft carriers each had 24 high-speed, long-range, long-endurance fighters capable of carrying combinations of 3 types of missiles, and a 20mm nose cannon. The Tomcat gets a 10 for beauty. Its curb appeal parked on the ramp is second to none, and its lines airborne, especially with the swing wing swept all the way aft to 68 degrees, are the look airshow photographers dream about. The F-14 had Hollywood good looks that made the original Top Gun the hit it remains 38 years on, and stole the show in the sequel Top Gun Maverick. The Tomcat gets a 9 for operational performance as the U.S. military's premier fighter during the Cold War, but also for how it pivoted to a precision-guided air-to-ground platform courtesy of the Lantern Pod. This capability was crucial toward the end of the F-14's service life in the post-9/11 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we can't forget the impressive combat record of the Iranian F-14s during the 8-year war with Iraq, or the fact the Iranian Air Force is still flying Tomcats to this day. And the Tomcat gets a perfect 10 for the overwhelming number of votes cast by subscribers in the channel community tab's comments. It wasn't even close, which naturally does my heart good. And all of those numbers add up to a Mooch Tally for the Tomcat of 29. So there you have it, the 10 most beautiful military jets ever. And remember, the Mooch Tally is an opinion, it's science. And thanks to the huge number of subscribers who entered their picks in the channel community tab comment section. As you can see, your inputs made a huge difference in the final Mooch Tallies here. You guys are what powers this channel. Do you have a military jet you think should be on the list instead? Let us know in the episode comments section below. All right, that'll do it for this episode. If you're not already a subscriber like those who entered their votes for this list in this episode, become one so you don't miss anything going forward. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.